By now, the world has become used to belligerent boasts and claims from Vladimir Putin, but in January 2024, he issued what may have been his most provocative edict yet, one with implications that go far beyond his already aggressive foreign policy. Here's a question: does Putin really believe that Russia still has a claim to Alaska? What might we expect from him toward America's most remote state? Let's find out. On the 18th of January, Putin signed a decree which sets aside money to search, register, and legally protect Russian property outside the borders of the Russian Federation. The stated purpose was to allocate funds for the process of searching the real estate property owned by the Russian Federation, the former Russian Empire, and the former USSR. Once found, there would be due registration of property rights and legal protection of this property. The territories subject to such legislation and legal protection were not named directly, but the Russian Empire and its successor state, the Soviet Union, at times included large parts of Eastern Europe, Central Asia, the American state of Alaska, and even isolated parts of the West Coast in the continental United States. Contrary to rumors that spread online in the aftermath of January 18th, the decree did not declare the Russian sale of Alaska in 1867 to be illegal. However, it was the latest instance of revanchist saber-rattling coming from Russian power centers. Some prominent Russian military bloggers, like the Two Majors Telegram channel, which has over 530,000 subscribers, were eager to see the decree be used as a basis for a new round of territorial disputes. Although their viewpoint has some influence, the military bloggers are not part of Russia's government, so we cannot take their posts as an indication of official policy. To see Putin's potential view on starting a territorial dispute over Alaska, we should first look at the history of Russia in the area, because Russia's record of territorial and cultural expansion is important in informing his view about his country's place in the world. Beginning in the 16th century, under Ivan the Terrible, Russia expanded in all directions at a rapid pace, and by the early 18th century, it was reaching the edges of the Eurasian landmass. In 1725, Peter the Great, victorious over Sweden in the Great Northern War, became interested in exploring the Northern Pacific and finding potential colonies there. He enlisted the services of the Danish navigator Vitus Bering in his enterprise. The strait between Asia and North America is now named in his honor. The first attempt in 1725 failed to reach North America, but Bering's second attempt in the 1740s succeeded. Although remote, the area was abundant in resources, especially the thick furs, which were also common in Siberia. Russia had long established its fur trade as a source of national wealth. Along this supply chain, Russian authorities would exploit the tribes of Siberia, exacting a tribute in furs at the trading posts it built in these vast open lands. The Tsars would then sell these furs in Europe at an enormous profit. Alaska strengthened Russia's fur trade in Europe and opened new markets too. After Russia established a presence in Alaska, adventurous frontiersmen and traders ranged through its territory, selling otter pelts to the Chinese. Catherine the Great created Russia's first formal Alaskan colony in 1784 at Three Saints Bay on Kodiak Island. Its governor was one of Russia's most successful fur traders, Grigory Shelikhov. An Orthodox mission was established there too. Russian explorers went further south in the early 19th century. They even reached California, where they established Fort Ross in 1812. However, the colony, governed by the Russian-American company that Shelikhov founded, was impossibly remote from the Russian heartland for it to attract many settlers. Sea otter populations also declined from overhunting, to the point of becoming extinct in certain areas. Populations have still not recovered today, and the otter remains listed as an endangered species by the International Union for Conservation of Nature. Worst of all, the situation in Eurasia was changing. Russia had entered a period of strategic competition with the British Empire in Central Asia as part of its quest for a warm water port. It also lost the Crimean War to Britain, France, and Sardinia, which came to the aid of the struggling Ottoman Empire. Facing such pressures, Russia decided that it could no longer hold Alaska, whose profitability was declining anyway. It did not want to see the British Empire gain the territory, which should have been easy for it to do based on its holdings in Canada. Worse, Britain extending its North American holdings to Alaska would put it on Russia's Eurasian doorstep. As early as 1859, Russia offered to sell Alaska to the United States, but the country was in the midst of a national crisis that led to a civil war, which delayed the proceedings. Once the conflict had ended and reconstruction in the South began, Washington was finally in position to make the purchase. Russia sold Alaska to the United States in 1867 for $7 million, or about $119 million in 2023 dollars, a price negotiated by then Secretary of State William Seward. The sale satisfied Russia's interests, as it provided a buffer and set the United States up as a counterbalance against Britain in the Northern Pacific. The reaction in America was to call the Alaskan purchase Seward's folly, but for the United States, the move was also useful to its own interests. It expelled Russia from North America and contained Britain in the Western Hemisphere, which it had long claimed preeminence over with the Monroe Doctrine. A gold rush in the closing years of the 19th century increased its population. Alaska became a formal territory of the United States in 1912 and the 49th state in 1959. The purchase and later statehood of Alaska meant that the United States and Russia share a maritime border. At its narrowest point between Cape Dezhnev and the Chukchi Peninsula in Asia and Cape Prince of Wales in North America, the Bering Strait is only 51 miles wide. The distance between Russia and American territory is much narrower at the Diomede Islands. The Russian Big Diomede Island is only 2.4 miles to the west of the American Little Diomede Island. In the accepted view of international relations, the sale ended any Russian claim to Alaska. It had willingly given up the territory, and both countries agreed on the present border. Putin, however, does not view the world in terms of defined nation-states entitled to sovereignty and territorial integrity within a strictly defined set of borders. These post-Westphalia and post-Versailles conceptions of the state are things which he believes to be expressions of a historical Western liberal universalism. He instead views the world as one of multiple civilizations or civilization states. This conception of statehood is one where the formal mechanisms of government power are primarily tasked with protecting a specific culture and its traditions. In whatever territory such culture and traditions are dominant, culture rather than politics or borders lies at the heart of statehood under his theory. Putin is not alone in this belief system. Xi Jinping, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan are all believers in this idea. Even Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has been called a proponent of the civilization state viewpoint. The recognized national borders of the present do not matter as much in the civilization state conception of the world. What matters, according to this belief, is the presence of a cultural tradition. This is part of the reason why Putin considered Ukraine to not be a real state, but rather a fictional construction of the West's post-Cold War international order based on the Westphalian and Versailles system. To him, Ukraine is an extension of Russian civilization, especially because of the time Ukraine spent under the governorship of Russian authorities and the large presence of ethnic Russians and Russian-speaking people within its borders. To see whether he thinks the same way about Alaska, we will need to look at Putin and other Russian leaders' past comments. In 2014, during an annual Q&A session with Russian citizens, a woman named Faina Ivanovna asked him whether he would ponder trying to get the territory back, saying that it was something Russians would be very happy to see happen. Putin in turn asked her why she needed Alaska. He said that the American purchase of the territory was inexpensive and that people should not get worked up about it. However, the tone began to change after the invasion of Ukraine. In July 2022, Vyacheslav Volodin, chairman of Russia's State Duma, said that Russia could lay claim to Alaska in response to American lawmakers' attempts to appropriate Russia's overseas assets. He was not the only member of the Duma to make such comments. In March 2022, Oleg Medvedev said that Russia should start thinking about reparations for the damage done by the sanctions and the war itself. Part of these reparations could include the return of all Russian properties, those of the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and current Russia, which has been seized in the United States, and so on. He even included the territory of Fort Ross and Antarctica, which he said belonged to Russia, because Russia discovered it. This language anticipated what would come in the January 2024 decree. In response to Medvedev, Alaska's governor Mike Dunleavy wished him luck, saying that there were hundreds of thousands of armed people in the state that would see it differently. In December 2023, another Russian lawmaker dropped hints that Alaska would be on Moscow's agenda. On X, a Duma member named Sergei Mironov suggested that American power around the world was waning and that Mexico should reconsider taking back territories it had lost to the United States in the Mexican-American War of 1846–48. Meanwhile, he said, Americans should think about their future and about Alaska. Under the civilization state theory, Russian claims to Alaska would come from its previous colonization there and the presence of ethnic Russians within the American state. Although the colony never had a high population, Russian culture and traditions survive from that time. For example, many of the communities in Alaska today trace their names from Russian sources, including Unalaska, the largest town in the Aleutian Islands. Kodiak Island still has recognizably Russian architecture and traditions. Russian cuisine is common in Alaska, as are Russian last names. There are also more recent Russian arrivals to Alaska, such as those in the village of Nikolaevsk, which hosts about 200 ethnic Russians. This population originates with a group of arrivals in 1968 after a split from the Russian Orthodox Church. Their way of life is still recognizably Russian, although Americanization is slowly creeping in. The political connection between Russia and Alaska may have ended in 1867, but such a connection is of secondary importance to Putin and other Russian expansionists who believe that cultural ties are at the heart of a civilization and its state. Russian territorial claims in Alaska would come primarily from these ties. In response to a new Russian edict, a spokesperson for the US State Department laughed and said that he's not getting it, Alaska, back. In response to the State Department's response, Dmitry Medvedev, the former president and prime minister of Russia, wrote on X that "We've been waiting for it, Alaska, to be returned any day. Now war is unavoidable." He accompanied the message with a laughing emoji, signaling that his message was a joke. The Institute for the Study of War was quick to point out that a claim to Alaska, if indeed the decree led to a territorial dispute, was not feasible, but that the reaction of the ultranationalist military bloggers like Two Majors is telling about how deeply entrenched revanchist sentiment is within some circles in Russia. Like Putin, these communities believe that the fall of the Soviet Union was a catastrophe that erased centuries of geopolitical gains for Russia. Russia's military bloggers have often been critical of the war in Ukraine, but because of the way the Kremlin has conducted the conflict rather than the invasion itself. For example, these voices have been critical of Putin's reluctance to issue an order for full national mobilization. These communities would likely support a territorial claim on Alaska, as Two Majors has already called for. For many reasons, a Russian military attack on Alaska is inconceivable, even without nuclear deterrence. A conventional attack would at a minimum require a complicated amphibious operation with full cooperation between the Russian Army, Navy and Air Force. Given Russia's problems in projecting power into its own backyard and its lack of a combined arms doctrine, this is an unlikely proposition. It would also be almost impossible for Russia to achieve surprise. The movement of necessary troops and equipment to the Russian Far East would be easy to spot with satellite surveillance. Even if this could be done, Russia would have to contend with the United States Navy and Air Force. An operation against Alaska is an absurd notion. But opening a territorial dispute over Alaska, however fictitious, could benefit the Kremlin in other ways. The Institute for the Study of War said that the Kremlin may use the protection of its claimed property in countries outside of its internationally recognized borders to forward soft power mechanisms in post-Soviet and neighboring states, ultimately aimed at internal destabilization. In other words, the decree could be seen as something of a gray zone operation. Russia's strategic partner China has demonstrated the effectiveness of gray zone operations against Taiwan and in the South China Sea. In the South China Sea, gray zone operations have seen an expansion of Chinese military presence. This expansion has led to a series of fortified artificial islands that have increasingly constrained the activities of other countries and international shipping in these economically critical sea lanes. On the Taiwan front, gray zone operations like constant sorties have steadily worn Taiwanese defenders down in money, material and morale. It's not out of the question that Russia could take a page from the playbook of its strategic partner. In a gray zone operation, Russia would not attack Alaska, but it could use the January 18th decree as a basis for a constant series of low-level military maneuvers. These maneuvers would force the United States to divide its resources and attention, concentrating more of them in this remote area rather than in Eastern Europe. There is recent precedent for this. In August 2020, the Russian Navy conducted war games near Alaska. According to Russian sources, 50 ships and 40 aircraft participated in the maneuvers in the Bering Strait with a series of practice missile launches. These exercises included the use of Onyx cruise missiles being launched at a target in the Gulf of Anadyr from the coast of the Chukchi Peninsula. At least one submarine also surfaced as part of this series of maneuvers. The commander-in-chief of the Russian Navy, Nikolai Yevmenov, said that these drills were the first of their kind in the Bering Sea and were part of Russia's efforts to expand its presence in the Arctic while protecting its resources there. The purpose of this exercise, he said, was for the Russian military to get used to the Arctic spaces as part of a build-up in forces to ensure the economic development of the region. The exercises saw an American response, with NORAD sending F-22 Raptors to intercept 6 Russian Tu-142 maritime patrol aircraft that stayed in the sky for roughly 5 hours and came within 50 nautical miles of Alaska. The intercept was the second time that summer. On June 10, 2020, 2 formations of F-22 Raptors intercepted 2 formations of Tu-95 Bear bombers. The first pair of Tu-95s was accompanied by 2 Su-35 fighters and an A-50 early warning and control aircraft. The second pair of Tu-95s also included an A-50 and got within 32 nautical miles of Alaska, although all of the Russian aircraft remained within international airspace. Another incident that strayed close to Alaska occurred in March. NORAD says that intercepts of Russian aircraft in the skies near Alaska are common, which only makes sense given the close proximity of American and Russian territory. However, Moscow has built up its military infrastructure in the sea, improving and expanding facilities in the Arctic region, including enhancements to runways and the stockpiling of additional air defenses. Such infrastructure could be used to launch a concerted campaign of grey zone operations, would allow for Russia to introduce chaos into American diplomacy and military planning. It would take attention from the State Department and force the Defense Department to put more of an emphasis in the region, as Russia gradually encroaches on it with repeat grey zone operations. There is also precedent for enemy operations against Alaska. The Japanese landed on the westernmost Aleutian Islands in 1942 and were only expelled after a campaign that lasted for a year. Russia need not stage a similar campaign on these remote outposts to catch the attention of Washington. Increased grey zone operations near North America would at least disrupt American strategy. The mere assertion of a legal mechanism in American territory can be considered a psychological grey zone operation, forcing policymakers in Washington to guess at how serious Russia is about it. More realistically, the January 18th edict is the latest expression of Putin's expansionist philosophy. To him, the dissolution of the Soviet Union meant the end of centuries of Russian gains in what he largely considers a tragedy for Russia and for the ethnic Russians who live in the post-Soviet states that were once part of the USSR or the Russian Empire. He has called the demise of the Soviet Union the end of historical Russia. On December 12, 2021, as he was amassing forces for his invasion of Ukraine, Putin hinted at the extent of his strategic ambitions. We turned into a completely different country after the fall of the Soviet Union, and what had been built up over 1,000 years was largely lost. He said that 25 million Russian people were now cut off from the motherland by being within the borders of the newly independent countries, a fact which he called a major humanitarian tragedy. Putin denied that he was planning on attacking Ukraine, but we saw what his word was worth 2 months later. Putin may lack the power to extend this worldview to the once imperial Russian holdings in North America, but the post-Soviet states in Europe and Asia do not have the benefit of being part of American territory. In the January 18th decree, we see further hints of how far he would be willing to go if given the opportunity. We should not be surprised if new, more aggressive legal edicts regarding the former Soviet and Russian imperial territory come out of the Kremlin in the near future. Perhaps Putin's view is that Russia can historically gain territory but never legitimately lose it. In illustrating this viewpoint, the Two Majors Telegram channel said after the edict, "We suggest starting with Alaska." Two Majors also said that the decree should include Dnieper, Ukraine, Bessarabia, the Grand Duchy of Finland, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, and the central states of Russian Turkestan, most of the Baltic provinces, and a significant part of Poland. Do you believe this is what Putin is also thinking? Will there be new edicts from Putin regarding territory that had once been under Russian jurisdiction? What Russian grey zone operations, if any, might we expect in Alaska in the near future? Don't forget to let us know in the comments. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more military analysis from military experts.